Over the past 50 years, Africa has received more than $1.2 trillion in foreign aid, more than the GDP of Spain, Australia, or South Korea. Yet poverty has not disappeared. In the 1960s, about 11% of Africans lived in extreme poverty. By the 1990s, that number had risen to 66%. Today, nearly 38% remain poor. Over half survive on less than $5.50 a day, and nearly 600 million people lack electricity. The West assumed money alone could solve poverty. This belief came from Europe's post-World War II recovery. The Marshall Plan, which invested over $13 billion between 1948 and 1952, helped GDP per capita in Western Europe grow nearly 35% in a decade. Cities were rebuilt, factories reopened, and millions were lifted from poverty. Africa, rich in resources like oil, copper, and diamonds, seemed the next target for aid. Programs grew from $500 million a year in the 1960s to over $50 billion by 2010. But results were different. Between 1970 and 2000, Africa's average per capita income declined, despite nearly $600 billion in aid. In many countries, aid accounted for over 60% of government budgets, reducing government's accountability to citizens and creating opportunities for corruption. Luxury goods, private jets, and extravagant trips often replaced investment in roads, schools, or hospitals. Experts estimate Africa loses $30 billion annually to corruption, and nearly 30% of all aid funds may have been misused. Aid also harmed local economies. Imported aid-funded goods outcompeted domestic products. In some nations, 80% of clothing sold was imported, leading to thousands of factory closures. Across Africa, industry's share of GDP fell from 15% to 10% over 2 decades. Large aid inflows also caused currency appreciation, making exports more expensive and reducing competitiveness. Today, African exports account for just 20% of GDP, far below East Asian economies like South Korea or Taiwan. Weak institutions are at the heart of the problem. Post-war Europe had ministries, courts, and bureaucracies capable of managing aid effectively. African countries, often newly independent, inherited fragile systems designed for extraction rather than development. Governments frequently serve elites with minimal accountability to citizens. Malawi illustrates this. In the 2000s, over 40% of its national budget came from aid, yet millions meant for schools, hospitals, and roads were diverted to private wealth. Similar patterns occurred across Uganda, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Aid unintentionally reinforced corruption and entrenched elites. The human impact is real. Children walk miles for water, families live without electricity, and entrepreneurs struggle against imported goods. Campaigns like Live Aid or Band Aid may have raised awareness, but structural poverty remains. Aid alone cannot fix systemic problems. Without strong institutions, accountability, and local economic development, aid often perpetuates dependency rather than growth. Africa's poverty problem is not a lack of money. It is structural, weak governance, poor institutions, economic distortions, and historical legacies. While aid can help during crises, decades of experience show it is not a sustainable solution. To understand why aid succeeded in Europe but failed in Africa, we must look at Europe's post-war recovery, the lessons from history, Europe's success. After World War II, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were destroyed, factories demolished, and millions displaced. Economies had collapsed, and the threat of communism loomed. The Marshall Plan was the answer, one of the most ambitious aid programs in history. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States invested over $13 billion, roughly $160 billion today, into Western Europe. But it wasn't just cash, it was strategically deployed. Funds rebuilt infrastructure, restarted industries, and stabilized governments. Roads, railways, hospitals, and schools were reconstructed, factories reopened, energy grids restored, and production resumed. The results were dramatic. GDP per capita in participating countries grew nearly 35% in a decade. Unemployment fell, wages rose, and millions moved from poverty to security. But Europe's success wasn't only about money. It relied on existing institutions, governance, and industrial capacity. Ministries, courts, and bureaucracies could manage funds effectively, enforce rules, and maintain accountability. Governments had incentives to use resources wisely, knowing citizens and international partners were watching. The plan also promoted industrial and export-led growth. Investments targeted productive industries that created jobs and generated income for domestic and international trade. Aid wasn't about handouts. It was about rebuilding capacity. Europe had three critical advantages that made aid work: functioning institutions, bureaucracies capable of managing resources and enforcing rules, accountability. Governments were answerable to citizens and international partners. Industrial base. Europe retained skilled workers, machinery, and expertise to rebuild industries quickly. These factors show why aid alone cannot guarantee success. Money amplifies capacity. It cannot create it from nothing. Africa, by contrast, lacked strong institutions, experienced widespread corruption, and had fragile industries. Without governance, accountability, and productive infrastructure, even billions in aid often fail to produce long-term growth. The Marshall Plan demonstrates a crucial truth. Sustainable development requires more than money. Aid must strengthen institutions, incentivize productive activity, and support governance systems. Europe thrived because aid was paired with capacity, accountability, and industry. After the perceived success of the Marshall Plan in Europe, Western nations poured money into Africa, believing the same strategy could lift the continent out of poverty. Aid programs grew rapidly, $500 million annually in the 1960s, nearly $20 billion by the 1990s, and over $50 billion per year by 2010. Yet the results were starkly different. Between 1970 and 2000, Africa's average per capita income declined, despite nearly $600 billion in aid. The core issue lies in weak institutions. Unlike Europe, many African countries were newly independent, inheriting fragile governments often designed for extraction rather than public service. Ministries lacked capacity, courts were weak, and bureaucracies were underdeveloped. Aid flows reduced incentives for accountability. Governments funded externally were less dependent on citizens and more likely to divert resources for personal enrichment. Luxury cars, private jets, and extravagant trips often replaced investments in schools, hospitals, or infrastructure. Estimates suggest Africa loses $30 billion annually to corruption, and nearly 30% of all aid funds may have been misused. Aid also distorted local economies. Imported goods funded by aid often outcompeted domestic industries. By the early 2000s, in some nations, up to 80% of clothing sold was imported. Thousands of factories closed, wiping out jobs and destroying industrial knowledge. Across Africa, industry's share of GDP fell from 15% to 10% over 2 decades. Large aid inflows caused local currencies to appreciate, making exports more expensive and reducing competitiveness. Today, African exports account for only 20% of GDP, far below East Asian economies like South Korea or Taiwan. Human impact is clear. Children walk miles for clean water, families live without electricity, and small businesses struggle to compete with imported goods. While campaigns like Live Aid or Band-Aid raised global awareness, the structural problems remained. Aid often created dependency rather than development, weakening the very systems needed for self-sustaining growth. Decades of foreign aid in Africa have created a dependency trap. When 40 to 60% of national budgets come from foreign donors, governments answer to outsiders, not citizens. Accountability disappears. Corruption thrives, and public services often fail. Aid also disrupts local economies. Imported goods funded by aid frequently outcompete domestic products. In some countries, up to 80% of clothing sold is imported. Local factories close, jobs vanish, and industrial knowledge is lost. Across Africa, manufacturing share of GDP fell from 15% to 10% in 2 decades. Small farmers and entrepreneurs struggle to compete, stifling innovation. Large aid inflows further distort markets. Converting foreign currency to local money strengthens the currency, making exports more expensive and reducing global competitiveness. Unlike East Asia, Africa cannot rely on export-led growth because its goods become unaffordable to buyers abroad. This combination of weak institutions, corruption, and distorted markets traps nations in a cycle. Aid increases, local industries decline, governments grow dependent, and poverty persists. Millions still live on less than $2 a day. Half the population lacks electricity, and schools and hospitals remain underfunded. Aid meant to lift people out of poverty often perpetuates underdevelopment and inequality. The human cost is clear. Children attend poorly equipped schools, communities lack infrastructure, and entrepreneurial talent leaves for opportunities abroad. Campaigns like Live Aid raise awareness, but they rarely address the structural problems. Aid can relieve suffering temporarily, but rarely creates lasting growth. Africa's experience shows a fundamental truth. Development cannot be bought with cash alone. Sustainable progress requires functioning institutions, accountable governments, and local industries. Without these foundations, even billions in aid can reinforce dependency, empower elites, and stifle innovation. Foreign aid in Africa has reshaped politics. When 40 to 60% of national budgets come from donors, governments answer to foreign agencies rather than citizens. This breaks the link between taxation and representation. Citizens lose leverage to demand better services, allowing corruption and elite enrichment to thrive. Malawi illustrates this clearly. In the 2000s, aid made up over 40% of the national budget. Millions meant for schools, hospitals, and roads were diverted into luxury cars, private estates, and international trips for elites. Similar patterns occurred in Uganda, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Leaders had little incentive to reform institutions or improve services because aid funding flowed regardless of performance. Aid also undermines political institutions. Governments funded externally can ignore citizen grievances without consequence. Elections become more about securing donor support than addressing local needs. Over time, civic engagement declines as people lose faith in the system. Corruption rises, with Africa losing an estimated $30 billion annually, including a large portion of aid money. Projects fail to reach intended beneficiaries, leaving education, healthcare, and infrastructure underfunded despite massive inflows. The human cost is stark. Communities remain underdeveloped, schools and hospitals under-resourced, and entrepreneurship suffers. Many talented Africans migrate abroad in search of opportunity. Governments focus on maintaining aid flows rather than promoting local development. Africa's experience highlights a harsh truth. Money without accountability undermines democracy and citizen power. Aid can provide short-term relief during crises, but as a long-term strategy, it often strengthens elites, entrenches corruption, and weakens the very institutions needed for sustainable development. Over the past 50 years, Africa has received more than $1.2 trillion in foreign aid. Yet poverty, weak institutions, and economic dependency persist. The continent's challenge is clear: transitioning from reliance on aid to sustainable, self-driven growth. The first step is strong institutions. Governments need ministries, legal systems, and bureaucracies capable of enforcing laws, collecting taxes, and managing resources. When citizens trust that funds are used responsibly, accountability improves, corruption declines, and public services reach the people. Lessons from Europe's post-war recovery show that functioning institutions are essential for development. Second, local industries must be empowered. Aid should support, not compete with, domestic businesses. Investments in agriculture, manufacturing, and technology can create jobs, increase exports, and build economic independence. Countries like Rwanda and Ethiopia demonstrate that targeted industrial policies, combined with infrastructure and skilled labor, can drive growth even with limited resources. Third, Africa must focus on self-sufficiency and export competitiveness. Stable currencies, training for skilled workers, and support for small and medium enterprises are crucial. Aid programs should prioritize capacity building, helping communities produce, trade, and innovate independently rather than relying on cash handouts. Finally, political reform is essential. Leaders must be accountable to citizens, not just donors. Strengthening democracy, promoting transparency, and reducing corruption ensures that resources are used for development rather than elite enrichment. Civic engagement, free media, and oversight can help break the cycle of dependency. Africa has the talent, resources, and potential to thrive. By building strong institutions, fostering accountable governance, and empowering local industries, the continent can finally turn decades of $1.2 trillion in aid into sustainable growth and lasting prosperity for future generations.